today we have a UP dialogue, and today we have a talk that connects all groups and talk about governance. And I'm really proud to introduce Professor Patrick Legales, who is a research professor from Sciences Po in politics and sociology. He is the founding dean of the Urban School, which had like a profound impact on the field of urban studies. He has written and edited many articles and books. Quite recently, I co-edited a book with Jennifer Robinson called Routledge's Handbook of Global Comparative Urban. No, now I'm making yeah, good. And one with Francesca Artioli about the Metropolis Paris. But also in the past, he has written books like The New Labor Experiment and many other excellent books. And he has a lot of experience in doing research in cities across the world, from Sao Paulo to Paris, Mexico City. And I'm sure that we are going to enjoy his lecture. And with that, I give the floor to Patrick.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. So it's a great pleasure to discuss with a group like you. I mean, this is a privilege in our job, is to do this sort of thing. So I'm very, very grateful. What I'm doing today is, we discussed yesterday a bit with Tuna, but is to say a few things about the governance theme from my point of view, and I will explain in a minute. It's also work in progress because we have been running for about 10 years this jazzy project. Well, minus COVID, let's say 7 years, with colleagues in Mexico, Sao Paulo, and London, on what is governed and not governed in large metropolis. So what I will do is just to tell you how my thinking on urban governance has changed over the years. And maybe one day I'll write a book on governing those metropolis. Well, maybe I should write, but I don't know if I will manage, but I'll try. So it's very much work in progress, and it's more conceptual, but there is some empirical research behind it. And in the discussion, we'll be able to do something about that. Yep. So urban governance, despite capitalist urbanization. And you remember that one of the big debate in urban studies is those who explain that the most important thing is a process of urbanization. And just for a joke, when I was a student in Oxford, I was a student of David Harvey, and a young postdoc joined. So Eric and myself were the two little lieutenants of David Harvey in Oxford, when nobody cared about what he was doing, basically. It was quite striking. So we learned a lot about capitalist urbanization. And the research group I funded at Sciences Po was called Cities Are Back in Town, which in a way is a contradiction with what David was saying, which was that cities had no explanatory variable in any big processes. So my point is, I think today in the current state of urban studies is sometimes we see those people doing urbanization process, and Neil Brenner will be the super big one doing these sort of things. But in a lot of empirical work, we see the role of cities, but we know that a lot of bad research was done on cities because they look at cities in a very fixed way, reifying a number of categories like government. And I always try to combine them to some extent. But if you think about governance as a way to say, well, there is some agency, there are processes and activities, maybe more or less important, that explain some of the transformation, including the urbanization process. So the first round of work that I will be using, and I want to emphasize, is that in the last 3 decades or so, we saw both things at the same time. We saw both very different various processes of urbanization. And my colleagues I mentioned, like Neil and all the rest, they love Henri Lefebvre. You have to know that in the French context, Henri Lefebvre was always considered as a third-rate sociologist. He was a very nasty guy, but that's a different subject. But he was a philosopher and a little bit of a sociologist. So in the French sociology, we all learned that Henri Lefebvre was third-rate, okay? But of course, sociologists were not interested in the urban, and they didn't look at all his urban work. And also, Lefebvre writing in French, well, should we say writing? It was like speaking and someone was reading. So it's very badly written with plenty of contradictions, full of fabulous intuition. So for my generation, when I was a student, nobody talked about Lefebvre. It was like, blah, blah, blah. And then it was reinvented by David Harvey and a few other people, thanks to the translation in English. And this woman, Elisabeth Lebas, has completely rewritten Lefebvre. And it should be Lefebvre and Lebas, not Lefebvre. So just to make a... So for us, Lefebvre was not so important. So the point is we have all these urbanization processes, but on the other end, over the last 3 decades or so, the reason why I mentioned cities are back in town is that what we have seen in a number of countries and continents is the dynamics of democratization in lots of states has led to more political resources accumulated at the level of cities. So the wave of democratization, South America is a good example, has led to the making and development of metropolitan government to some extent, but also more resources and public resources control at the metropolitan level. So democratization, it's very clear in Africa as well, to more politicization of the urban and some capacity at this level. What do we do with that? It's been social. The second reason why those cities in the wide sense, in open sense, okay, not in the narrow sense, is of course the wave of economic restructuring connected to this wave of capitalism has created lots of, as usual, massive inequalities between territories, and the politicization of those inequalities is giving a dynamics to local politics in order to resist or to accompany this economic globalization restructuring. And thirdly, what we have seen in many parts of the world, I'm generalizing far too much, but you have serious data on Latin America, you have more and more of that in Africa, Europe has been very strong on that, we see some of that in Asia, is that forms of decentralization pushed by the World Bank often have led to, mayors, metropolitan government, the world of urban policies and politics has become more significant with, you mentioned this morning, processes, I would say activities. So we see more and more activities, more and more budgets, more and more law, more and more social conflict, more and more groups spending some resources at this urban level. So it may not lead to much. It may be more or less relevant to explain some of the transformation, but we see lots of activities and we can measure that with data in all sorts of ways. So I wrote a paper about this rise of local politics, trying to make this argument that there are good reasons to study cities and urban policies and governance because we have these big trends. And again, and I will nuance in a minute what I'm saying. The other thing you have to keep in mind is, as usual, when you think about cities, I am not among those in urban studies. Some people think, like my friend Jenny Robinson, we live in cities, living in a world of cities, if you remember the famous paper she wrote. I think she's completely wrong. That's one of my points of debate with Jenny. We live in a world of cities, of NGOs, of states, of international organizations, of large firms. So my point is that we see some movements so that more and more cities are becoming involved in some forms of collective action, maybe diplomacy, as Akuto is showing, but they are still part of the state as well, okay? And when you look at classic figures, public expenditure as percentage of GDP, as you know, we have been told that we have a big neoliberal area period where every public expenditure was destroyed. Oh yeah. What we have seen is most countries of the world is a rise of public expenditure, including in Latin America. And in Europe has been very significant in the 1990s as well. Now it's stabilized. So we have a long-term trend of increase of public expenditure in most countries with some recent decline after COVID. But the trend has been, not neoliberals in the sense of some element, but not at all in some other elements. So we have more public expenditure. Latin America is a good example. We have more and more resources, and a lot of those resources and budgets and public policies are developed at the urban level. So you can measure the expertise, you can measure the resources from outside, but you can also measure both tax budgets, capacity to develop public expenditure. I'm not saying that's good. You can use that to exploit people, to increase the police, to have predatory government, okay? It's not good in itself, but you have more and more activities connected to public policies and governance developing at the urban level in many parts of the world, okay? India, less so. And we have evidence of that. And those figures are particularly strong and go over time. So that's the thing I wanted to emphasize. The third thing is what we've been trying to do in urban studies, some of us for a long time, is although we understand that cities are part of state, we have tried to understand the extent to which we could develop an ontology of cities a bit different from the state, particularly in political science and sociology. Meaning, you have politics in cities, but it's not exactly the same politics that at the state level. So some attempt is made to show that some issues of infrastructure, of housing, of planning, of forms of inequalities, forms of mobility, of bringing various migrants in a sort of urban society are more and more comparable among a number of cities in the world. And that's a bit different from what happened at the national level. So the idea is, to what extent can we try to explain that there are forms of governance that are more and more urban in those metropolis, and in part influenced by the national level, but more and more comparable among many cities. And all the literature on urban diplomacy, on circulations, on policy mobility is making the point about this development of horizontal network and creating a world of urban policies that is more and more disconnected from the national world. And you think about large firms in infrastructure, think about consultants, think about the World Bank. There are a number of ways to think about that. And I think looking at the governance of those cities in that sense is an interesting way to see the extent to which, how far we can go in pushing and trying to think about the limits of government as well. And doing that means to look at particular conflict, and conflict of those. Some urban conflict remain, they can be similar to some rural conflicts, but some of them are very urban, and on various infrastructure, on various issues of diversity, on various issues of political economy. You can really start to think, and of course the climate crisis is there, you can sort of try to map out a sort of world of urban policies and governance that may need to be constituted in a more systematic way. So that was a project with Jenny on this global urban comparative world, where we try to do that to some extent. And of course, cities not as a classic territory. So in a way, what I'm trying to do here is the extent to which these metropolitan areas, and that's again a conclusion both from the work of Jessop or Brenner or Eric on capitalism requiring more urban to organize the accumulation regime. And it's also the conclusion of people looking at various ways to govern societies where the urban is getting more autonomy, more resources, and more capacity to develop its own rules of the game. So can we qualify this governance and those conflict as consequence of capitalism dynamics, but also developed as part of this nation state? And I want to emphasize that taking this governance angle doesn't mean that governance is always important. There are lots of cases with this governance of both cities just doesn't matter and doesn't explain much. So it's more an hypothesis, and then you look empirically if it does explain a lot or not. So thinking about urban governance, what I want to do now is come back on my own thinking about that. I'm not doing a field of urban governance. I'm just telling the way with my group we have been trying to think along those terms. The first thing I want to emphasize is the theoretical influence, because often it's not well understood where it's coming from, the way we have been thinking along those terms. And basically, what we've been doing in my group and my own work was to combine Max Weber, Foucault, and Polanyi. That's the really hard beginning. I always remained Weberian in some ways, so it took some years to know whether I was a Marxist or Weberian, but I decided for Weber, because I think it explains, it makes sense to understand the society I'm studying. But two or three things. Number one, what's interesting about Weber is, of course, to have a more economic sociology, political economy of understanding of a number of social phenomena with some very strong autonomy, of course, of politics and institutions. And Weber emphasized that the machinery of government is very important. So first thing to remember is to remember that you have a political dimension, of course, and an autonomy of politics. But you also have a machinery that you have to study. The thing I take from Foucault, and lots of things from Foucault, but number one, you try to avoid starting by looking at city-state. You always do a pas de côté, and you try to understand I think for me, the main lesson in terms of research from Foucault is concentrate on activities and dispositif. So if some people are doing things, look at that and how they do that. And by looking at activities and dispositif, then you have a way to understand some social phenomenon. So it's a very empirical advice. And I always do that. And I've done a lot of work in public policy, focusing on policy instruments, which I think have some long-term influence on a number of issues. And Polanyi, that's of course to try to think about this connection between capitalism and society, and to see that at some moment, it's all governed by more of the economic dynamics, that sometimes society resists, there's some backlash, and looking at this tension between economy and society. And that was the way I'm trying to think about urban governance, to think about autonomy of politics within a political economy, to think about the rationality of governments. But that's the second lesson from Foucault. It's not, it's already a problem with some of political science. They say, governments govern, and they look at government everywhere. Well, governments govern, yeah. Students study, yeah, more or less. Not on Saturday night, not my students. Workers work, yeah, more or less. It's the same thing. Governments govern, but more or less. And with different intensity, I will come back to that, more or less different groups, different territories. So we have to think about government and governance with the limits. So in a way, it's also to try to think historically about the limits of political regulation. So I see this tension between social dynamics, this political dynamics, and how capitalism will be more determining what happens at some given moment. So the idea is to transform this Weberian Polanyi idea as precise research project. And those people who have been working along those lines that I use for my work, a lot of them come from Italy. So the Italian social science was one of the most brilliant in Europe for many decades, and completely unknown because it was in Italian, unfortunately. So from Gramsci influencing Paci, Bagnasco, Trigilia, the Third Italy, all those people, the idea is to think about modes of articulation between some territory, some types of firms, some type of family regulation, and the way they were articulated in some specific social formation, to take the first of Gramsci. I remember Gramsci was obsessed from day one by the difference between the north of Italy and the south of Italy. And he was trying to understand both the land ownership regime, the structure of family, the type of economic development. So what the Italian political economy was doing was to think about those articulation in some ways, often with a minor view of politics, but then more and more taking that into account. The second ideas I'm taking to develop my thing about governance is the sociology of the state. You cannot think about cities in most parts of the world if you don't understand the state. So there's a big sociology of the state, both Marxist and non-Marxist, which you need to underline. And in one of the book we did with my colleague Desmond King on the transformation of the state in Europe, we emphasize, for me, what is the key element is that still today, and Jessop was influential there, people think about the state with, state responding to the citizen. So a lot of political science, you look at the rational voters, voting, you have a government, and then the government does what the voters are saying. Is to study public policy, it's rarely the case. And I think one of the key elements, especially in the European context, is that what happens nowadays is that state elite, they respond to citizen. Okay, that's one. But in fact, part of the EU, state elite, they respond to other states and to the EU. So they have a second constituency. And most of the policies they develop is related to what the other countries are doing and the EU. And the third one, it's what the Marxists have shown, is that when you have in-debt states, there's a third constituency. You have to pay your debt. So you are responsive. You have a third constituency, which are large firms, all the financial institutions. So in fact, we still think about the state in a sort of territorial manner, when in fact they are responding to three complete different constituencies. And I've written about that. I think it's a key element. The most important Weberian scholar on the state is called Gianfranco Poggi, and he wrote beautiful things on the unifying energy of a state. My argument is that states nowadays, particularly in Europe, but that's not just for Europe, they have lost their unifying energy. In fact, they are so busy to respond to the needs of the two other constituencies that they have allowed for lots of inequalities within the territorial framework. And I think if you want to understand territorial inequalities in Europe and beyond, you have to understand the capitalism effect, but you also have to understand that the politics of unifying has completely gone down as a priority in most countries. So thinking about the state, then of course critical geography, always important. Magnuson on this sort of ontology of cities, planners, economic geographers, mobility, public policy, da, da, da. So trying to do something with that. So my first thinking about governance was developed when I was working on European cities. So it was in the 90s. So I was working on Coventry, Norwich, Saint-Etienne, and Rennes, and I was very influenced by David Harvey because I was there. But it just didn't work. It didn't work in the sense that in a number of European cities, we saw some of the things that David was explaining, and it was, basic line. But on the other end, we were seeing very different things. What happens in European cities before the US was group of people, new urban left post 68, increasing budget, developing strong policies in a number of domains, being extremely innovative, reinventing strategic planning, and trying to transform those cities as collective actor. And the second thing that was very important is that their economy was very close to the public sector because of a strong welfare state. So they were not all entrepreneurial. The paper by David in '89 is one of my favorite paper ever, Entrepreneurial Governance. And that was part of the story, but that was not enough. A lot of other things were going on with long-term effect on the type of inequalities, the type of housing, the type of transport, the type of public goods that were produced. So it was not enough to remain that. So I tried to develop a conceptualization of governance that would make sense for European cities. And European cities at that time, I pushed forward this concept using Max Weber, with the idea that some cities are more or less integrated by exchange between different groups and have more or less capacity to solve conflict. Solving conflict is essential. So what we saw in a number of European cities were more resources, more exchanges territorialized and not going through a state, and more capacity to develop collective strategy and to implement them with more resources and more money and more organization. So it worked because it was not Paris and London or Istanbul and Moscow. It was because the bulk of European cities, as you know, are between 200, 300 and 1 million inhabitants, where you had long-term institutions, very strong political legitimacy. I am a mayor in Europe, where you have support from the EU at that time. There were also, the economic development was very strong. So it was a particular urban formation. And in a way, my work on governance and European cities was, no, the world is not global cities of Saskia. No, it's not Manuel Castells. No, it's not only capitalism explaining what was going on. There was this world of Europe attempting at that time to have a social market. They failed, trying to develop something. And both cities were developing a completely different urban world from what you would see in Phoenix, Arizona, in New York, or in other parts of the world. So the idea was, let's provincialize Europe, okay? Let's see it as a particular historical trajectory based upon the state and public policy. And you saw my figures earlier on. Europe is the land of public policy. We spend more money in public policy. Good or bad is another question. We have more civil servant, more welfare state, more public policy for a long time. 20 points GDP per head more than the US. So it's a massively different urban world and public policy world. And I wanted to make sense of this big thing. And that's why I was. So governance was understood as capacity to give. So governance comes from gubernantia in Latin, okay? Steering. So you need to exercise some pressure and to give a direction. And what was important in the 90s was this capacity in a number of European cities to sort of put some resources together, differentiate from the national, get some horizontal links, get some EU money, and to try to develop some project with some originality to give a particular direction to those cities. Some of them failed miserably. Some of them did very well. And I used to work on the Rennes, because I come from Brittany, I want to speak fast, on the Celtic part of France. So we know that you have to not trust the state too much. Rennes developed a very important project I studied at that time. Still today, the French city with the lowest level of inequality. So there are some long-term consequences of those strategy. So it's not just a joke. And then I developed some work with Colin Crouch. One of the most important group of scholars in Europe in the 1990s was the comparative political economy people. So for those of you, you forgot, of course, because you didn't know, in the 1980s, there was just no comparison in Europe. Okay, it just did not exist. You were in French, the world was French. In the Netherlands, it was Dutch. Sometimes they met in New York once in a while, but the number of comparison was zero, okay, more or less. So it was a time where lots of people developed work, and the most important scholars were the Polanyian comparative political economy people, comparing varieties of capitalism within European countries, looking at trade unions, interest groups, forms of state, and various capacity to organize that. And we did that sort of work at the local and regional level with Trigilia and Colin Crouch and those people. So we're thinking of governance in that sense of this capacity to produce collective goods using some market, some non-market mechanism, but creating some distinguish. And we are showing in the book that it worked a bit in some countries, but not much in many other countries. So in a way, we destroy the idea that it was at that time very popular with the EU, that industrial districts were becoming big in Europe. They were not. It was like a completely non-thing. The third thing I tried to do in my governance work was to try to think about the limits of governance and to look at governance failures and public policy failures. And what was interesting was trying to show that in my work in a number of European cities, Helsinki was another one, it was quite clear that there were some elements, but my idea was always, it's not the governance in the classic sense of, a city surrounded by walls. You have circulations, the limits of city are not clear, governments can do some things, but they fail in a number of things. So it's just, the idea was, think about governance as the limits of political regulations, what is not achieved, what is not done in a number of cities. We mentioned housing crisis this morning, but I can tell you a catalog of failures to deal with urban poverty, failures to deal with migrants, failures to develop public transport. A number of things didn't work very well, okay? In comparative terms, depends, but, and focusing on that, the idea was to look at both policy networks and governance, but also what is governed, and emphasize by looking at those cities, what was striking is very often those who are governed are like the middle class. They are very heavily governed. But when you think about it, a lot of the upper class, they're not governed very much because they can escape. And now we know that very well. They can invest resources outside. They have lawyers to prevent some laws. They can escape going to jail when they are boss. And the more illegal migrants or the lower middle class, they develop illegal activities or informal activities. So they're not governed the same way either. So the idea was to try to think about governance in a more relative way on what it can achieve and not achieve, and what sort of collective action are able to transform the city or not. And the second insight was to try to say, well, even when I look at some neighborhoods or some cities, not every territory is governed the same way. At that time, I was doing some work in Paris as well. And, if you're at the center of Paris, it's heavily governed. Okay, you have police everywhere and public policy and public everything. But if you go in the suburb far away, I used to work in Mantes-la-Jolie, they put 25,000 working class people and migrants in a small town, and they didn't change the structure. So you had no police, you had no hospital, you had no public services. It was just not governed at all. And nobody cared unless there was riots. So the idea is that you have different intensity of governance in different territory part of the city. And we have to understood that governance, for me, governance is not fragmented. The idea of fragmentation is part of governance. It's non-linear. So you have to understand the mode of governance in the city with very different intensity over time and over territory and over social groups. So that was where we developed the sociology of governance in a different way. And from that, we tried to push the idea of, how you govern is more important than who is governing and for whom. So we use this Foucault idea and Weberian, looking at the dispositif, the policy instruments, the data, the strategy you use, and looking at how those cities are governed gave you a lot of insight to understand what happens at the implementation stage, emphasizing sometimes the autonomous effect of some policy instruments and dispositif on what is there. So in a way, I was doing was to emphasize that it's not because you look at governance that you look at politicians. Sometimes they just follow. You may know the work of Christopher Hood, who's a great scholar in Oxford, who wrote a great book about blame game. And he explains that in lots of public policies, that's also true for urban policy, you have more and more goals, more and more objectives. And the more you are uncertain of your capacity to implement, the more you bring goals and objectives. And then you start something, and then you say at the end, oh, that's exactly what we wanted to do. Okay? So the idea is that the political goals were less and less relevant to explain the policies being implemented and the goals themselves. So the idea is that you have to spend less time on decision making and on political goals, but to concentrate on what happens, the process, the activities, the instruments, and to see how part of the politicization process takes place at the stage of implementation with some autonomous effect of the instruments or the dispositif. So that was the big thing that we developed on those elements. And by doing that, I was not very convinced by the wave of post-neo-Marxist work on everything is neoliberalization, because I take that seriously. And if you don't explain me what is different between a neoliberal and a liberal, I don't accept that. I think some people, when David Harvey does that, it's very clear. He knows exactly what he's doing. So we know where we are. But for lots of people, it's very confusing, including my three amigos, good friends, Nick Theodore, Jamie Peck, and Neil Brenner, whom I think at the end they're saying, oh yeah, it's all one direction, but it's variegated and it's different and it's there, and you never measure anything. And I don't think they are serious about neoliberalization because it's everywhere, and they combine a structural element of explanation with it's all diverse and we are super constructivist. So Neil tells me, yes, it's called sophisticated contradictions. But I call that contradictions. I mean, I just don't agree with it. So I tried to dispute the idea that every urban governance was becoming neoliberal, and Turkey was a good example of that. And then, in this governance thing, we thought we had to think also at the transformation of a state, because you really need to understand that one of the reasons where this mode of governance are evolving in cities is because the states are operating in a different way. And then the influence of Neil Brenner is obvious. So we did those books on the sort of political sociology of a state, emphasizing one key point, which is what we call denationalizations of political authority. Basically, what you see in most countries, and that was done in Europe, is that the capacity of a state to solve a number of conflicts, to deal with a number of issues, has been decreasing. And sometimes we talk about the state as managing authority. It's not one actor among others. There's far more resources. But this idea of monopoly of violence just doesn't work anymore. It's a completely undermining classic understanding of a state. And if you have denationalizing of political authority, then it allows for some policy entrepreneurs to develop forms of collective actions and governance at different level. Could be regions, could be cities, but not all of them, some of them. And I thought it would explain a little bit what happened in many European cities. And from there, you could think about these shifting relations between cities and states, but thinking not just about the urban dimension, but also the state dimension. That's the Charles Tilly lesson. You always have to think of the dynamics between the two, but they are not stable category. So not the same states and these urban cities being reconfigured, but in the European context, at least, you see more and more resources, legitimacy, and political structuring of this metropolitan government that we were interested. And then what we did to think with a group of people I work with was to try to use those various ideas with my friend Tommaso Vitali and to think about a long-term empirical project, trying to express this with proper empirical research. So we developed what I call a JASI project. JASI means we didn't have budget to do 10 years of systematic research. That's what it means. So you do what you can when you have the money to do 2 or 3 countries for, and then you do that. So we work with the group of Eduardo Marques in São Paulo, which is developing some ideas very similar to mine on those issues. Vicente Ugalde at CEDUA College de Mexico, Mike Racco in London, and my group in Paris. And we try to apply this research framework. So we have done 7 books so far. And I will say a few things about this research now. So we've done 2 books on São Paulo, 2 in Paris in French, it will come in English one day, 1 in Spanish, and also Milan was part of that. And we developed this framework of urban governance using all those ideas I'm mentioning. I will put them together, but adding another dimension. When you look at Mexico and you think about the governance of Mexico, again, you know that what you do is one bit of a story. You're not saying the governance of Mexico is structured very well, clear, explaining things. No, this is Mexico, just it's a different scale. But there are some issues that if you do not look at that, you understand nothing. Like the police in Mexico is the most important police force of all South America, because historically, when democracy came in, the military tried military coups, so the democratic president used the police to fight the army, and ever since, the police has been extremely powerful in Mexico. So there are a number of issues connected to corruption, policing, drugs, cartels that are part of the governance of those big cities. And we think that's one of the questions that is not been done in a way. So at the moment, with my colleague, I don't know if you know Federico Varese, who is an Italian sociologist who works on the mafia in Russia, and mafia on the move. He looks at how mafia, goes into different cities and compare that. And Gabriel Feltran, who works on the PCC in São Paulo, and look at the drug trafficking between African, European, Rotterdam, European Antwerp, and Le Havre, and Brazilian cities. And we try to understand how this governance is also about trying to govern or not the mobile population and the circulations. I'm not very impressed by the policy mobility literature because they don't look at the implementation in those different cities. And I think they miss something from that point of view. So and that's a book that one day will come in. So in idea, it started from boring local government studies. And I know when I explain my research, people say, oh, local government is so boring. Yes, it's boring, but you have rules, you have budgets, you have political activities, you have elections sometimes, and you have implementations or not of some plans over time. So quite often it doesn't explain very much, but sometimes it does, and you see some transformations and conflict organized around a local government. So I'm not talking about stateless cities. I think they are part of a state, and you have to look at those various elements. And one of the strong things for us was to emphasize the importance of conflict in those cities. And that's where I slightly disagreed with some people on post-democracy. But of course, it's a normative project, not an empirical project that you had, because we didn't see technocratic government governing those cities. In most cities we study, we see very strong conflict. And I'll take the example in fact, we see right-wing revanchism, we see green politics, we see left-wing capacity trying to impose things, major conflict about housing and transport going on in those cities. And the last point I want to emphasize is that in my thinking about urban governance, I use a lot of public policy. And one of the elements we're making in public policy research is, no, sometimes elections bring new politicians that will change the policies. Sometimes, okay? But what we argue in public policy is that quite often public policies are implemented with very strong institutional, and at the implementation stage, you see new actors coming in, politicization, protest. So in fact, it's public policies structuring politics. And I think in urban governance, it's a very important issue. It's the implementation of policies, structuring some conflict and some political element. So that's more or less the element. Of course, by doing that, I was always facing the literature on ungovernable metropolis. That's where I became a little bit not convinced by some planners. The number of books written about, Mumbai is ungovernable. We developed a plan and that was not implemented. And you know what? Jakarta is ungovernable. And you know what? Paris, we did a plan that was not implemented. It's ungovernable. No, plan is just one bit of what governance is about. It can be a very important part in some case, but very weak in some other case. That was so I was not very impressed by all this literature on post-metropolis, citizen without cities. Informality proves that governance is not relevant. It's the opposite. Very often informality is organized to make the city governable. So it's not. So that's one thing. Or you have the other criticism, that's our friend Michael Stopper, explaining that the city is about all rational choice people. People are moving. It's impossible to govern. It's all rational choice of people. I know, just the economics view of cities, and I don't think it works at all for the sort of things I study, at least for sure. You may remember there's a famous book in 1997 by a guy called Douglas Yates. Remember New York went bankrupt? And then Yates wrote this book explaining that New York had become ungovernable because urban policymaking is incapable of producing coherent decisions, developing effective policies, implementing state programs. So it's failure. So it's ungovernable. But in which world do you think that policies are always rational, effective, and coherent? This is just for children. I mean, it's never like that. So that's not a sign of ungovernability. I was in New York 2 years ago for 4 months, and people told me that it's ungovernable and da 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 da. And then you realize that you have some private developers have been there for a long, long time, and they organize very well their development. You realize that there are some very stable corruption system in Harlem, very stable over time. You have a number of things that are very well organized, so it's just governed in a different way than what people have in mind. So this crisis of ungovernability is a UN report, but I don't want to say. So the urban research on this question of governance is always saying, it's too many actors, disperse, you have limits of government. Oh, yeah. You have all overlapping scales. Yeah, welcome. You have overlapping scales. We do that. You have heterogeneous population. Oh, yeah, we have. We have conflict. Sure. Informal activities. Yeah, that's a world of governance. Okay, that's what happens in many cities. That does not mean that they are not governed. Of course, there are failures everywhere. So what I want to finish is just to explain more precisely the framework we have. Okay, number one, large metropolis are not entirely governed. Government only explains something. So the governance, for me, agenda is what are the limits of governance and what is not explained at all by governance. Okay. Second, government policies do not explain everything, we're clear, and different categories can go. And it's complex. Oh, yeah, it's complex. Thank you. Right, well. So the question I ask are the following. Number one, governments govern, so what? One of the big things we know is that we want to see consequence of what happens. We try to measure some impact, and we look at long-term consequence. What is, for me, the most obvious result is that when you see some mode of governance relatively structured and with some clear rules of the game, 30 years later, it makes a big difference. Okay, London is less and less like Paris for the good or the bad. Okay, Rome has developed a very particular mode of. Oh, by the way, nobody works on the governance of Rome. You know why? Because they don't want to work on the Vatican, Vatican owns 25% of building in Rome, and nobody works on governance of Rome. It's too complicated because of the church. Yeah, it's complicated, but why don't we do that? I mean, let's try. So governance, so what? Second, classic questions, who governs and for whom? Of course, we must always do that, clear. But as I say, when you think about governance, it's a relation. So you should always ask who is governed and what territories are governed, okay? So that's where I'm sort of not always in competition. Critical of science, they say government's governed. But who is governed is central. Governance is a relation. So we must all be geographers and sociologists. If not, we cannot say anything about governance. And then how does government work? What are the policy instruments, the dispositif, the algorithm, the data, the charters, all the instruments that are used and their effect over time? What is not governed? What are the main failures? What are the territories where some governance is not there? I mean, there are places where schools, nobody cares, they completely decline, or hospitals are going down the tube, or some housing is not renovated, or public transport never go there. So let's concentrate on what is not governed and the main policy failures. And then who governs when nobody governs? Well, we know some mechanism going on. We know the churches historically. We know the mafia. We know some family oligarchy. I remember some of my postmodern American friends telling me, well, it's all your idea of governance is too classic. I took them to Florence, where the Frescobaldi and the Antinori, two wine big company for one 200 years, the other one 800 years, are still competing to be involved in private development projects. So not everything changes over time, and land ownership is one of them. Who benefits? And this dark side of governance, how we bring police, corruption, gangs in the governance of those cities. So that's a framework that we developed in those four cities. So trying to avoid being naive on this thing and emphasizing this, that was the influence of Bruno Latour, who was my colleague at Sciences Po, and I should stop, that government governs, but not everything, not every sector, not all the time. You have discontinuity. And the sociology of science and technology, STS, help us to understand that sometimes you have production of knowledge, but you also have discontinuities in the governance of those cities. And some governed are more governed than others. So I will stop there. I will just give you one example of something we developed recently. So, well, there's definitions of conceptions of governance, so we don't care about that. I would say, to finish off, we just finished two books on Paris. And there are two things I want to share with you. The first one is that we tried to make database of conflict going on in Paris over the last 30 years. So we tried to map out systematically all the conflict to see whether we see depoliticization, we see more technocratic government, we see, it's not the big social movement times of the 70s. What can we say about that? And we have identified 5 types of conflict that have developed over time, and Julie Pollard, that you mentioned earlier, is in charge of this thing. Number one, we've seen classic conflict about public services. So in a classic European case, part of the redistribution goes through access to services that are cheap, let's say, to some extent. And we see in Paris, but also in other cities we study, very clear conflict on how much do we pay for public transport, how much do we invest for public transport. We see strong debate on social housing, how much social housing we go or do we leave private developers to do. We see very strong conflict on schools, private education, exclusiveness of some schools, and very strong conflict on health services. Surprise, surprise, in Paris, you have a super concentration of doctors in the nice arrondissement. And when COVID struck, we realized that in Saint-Denis, a very poor place in the Paris region, the rate of doctors and hospitals was down the tube, and it was very bad in terms of death. Okay, so we see clear political conflict with clear opposition and clear politicization of this conflict. Second conflict we see are conflict about urban development project, but not very much. Okay, one of our surprises is that when you look, you do a database of all the urban conflict. We like, as urban scholars, big conflict about urban redevelopment projects. Over 30 years in Paris, in the Paris region, very little, very little. A little bit, there's one big project that was cancelled called Europa City, a big thing. But I suspect that because it was Chinese private developers that it helped to cancel it. A couple of projects were cancelled. Protests against the Olympic Games, very small. 12 people, very small thing. So multiplication of very small, small thing on one street, but more or less very strong decline or urban protest on redevelopment project. Third, very strong left-right conflict. This idea that left-right conflict is declining doesn't work at all. In many cities, you see very strong conflict on culture, on all the issues I mentioned, on what do we do with migrants, with refugees, with education, with a tax system, with what do we do with water. So very strong left-right conflict politicized in election. 4, very strong conflict between institutions, between regions and cities, between cities and the state. This is a very important part of the conflictuality we see in this sort of a multi-level conflict between them. So rescaling in Neil's terms. And fifthly, one of the most important set of conflict are between the socialists and the Greens. And we see conflict about refugee, housing, environment, biodiversity, food, race and gender. Among the most important conflict are within the left, and a lot of left-wing government in the thing. So, that's my last two slides. We try to characterize the governance of Paris with this agenda that I mentioned, and we're doing work on drug trafficking and all sort of things, as organized anarchy, meaning the classic model of governance that I developed for European cities, middle size, doesn't work at the scale of Paris. So the idea of organized anarchy is an old idea in sociology of organization and public policy. It's the idea that you have coexistence of lots of organizations with different objectives, no hierarchy. Most organizations have limited knowledge and understanding of the other ones. And the composition of the group can change regularly. And it's a world where solutions are looking for problems. But it's not completely anarchy. We see that there are mechanisms that allowed for collective action. Okay, so it's not ungovernable. Despite all this diversity and you have some elements, some sectors, some territories are very strongly governed. And at the scale of a metropolis, there are some mechanisms that allowed for some collective action to take place sometimes. Okay, the first classic one is, of course, the coalitions. So some groups make coalitions in order to promote some project. I don't know, at some point they all decided that air pollution was important. The city hated the region and the Greens hated the right, but at some point they created a coalition to do something about air pollution, and it was implemented over time. The second way is a lot of collective action over big transport that is being built in Paris. The second coordination mechanism and governance mechanism is seizing contingent opportunities. We are struck by the fact that in a number of public policies, the governance is about, well, some people develop some solutions and then they wait. And one day there's an opportunity and they arrive and say, oh, we have the solution. Okay, like some people wanted to develop a new big Ministry of Defense like the French Pentagon. Well, some people wanted, meaning Bouygues, the #1 constructor in the world, and they have a big project with a private-public financing, and they could not do it. But at some point, our new president, Sarkozy, decided there was a big problem with the Ministry of Defense, and he had to do something about that. So the solution was there, and he invented a problem to justify the project. So we see a lot of solutions ready and then implemented when there is an opportunity. Thirdly, we see a lot of governance being done because of instruments, data in particular. So there's a huge effort to gather some data in a number of domains. People have no idea about what they want to do. So they develop a charter, a policy instruments, an observatory, and we see what happens. And eventually they develop some policies. And we see a lot of that. And finally, we see a lot of capacity to have negative governance, and veto groups are very, very important. So we developed some research about that, and we applied this framework in the case of Paris, and we're trying to do that. So this is it. I just wanted to give you an idea about how we evolve over time in our thinking about governance, and we're trying to use this framework to understand and to characterize the governance of Mexico, São Paulo, Paris, and London, with both the idea of limits, discontinuity, #1. Second, some sectors, some domains, some groups, you see a lot of governance going on, but lots of failures and things not governed. And thirdly, to try to characterize forms of governance that are not about, heroic decision makers doing public policy, but this mix of partial governance together with some collective action being done, and sometimes with capacity to govern, but sometimes just capacity to regulate and not to govern. Thank you.